Okay, hello and welcome back to class. I hope you are doing well today. And I'm looking forward to today's class because we're going to be talking about community ecology, something that I find really interesting. It's probably my favorite thing to study in ecology and biology. So, looking forward to talking to you about that today. We're going to talk about the role of species and how that's defined, the different ways species interact with each other, and then how those interactions determine the composition of ecological communities, and really talk a little bit about what an ecological community actually is. And then at the end, there's an activity for you to do about barnacles, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So today we're talking about species interactions and communities. And before we do that, I just want to take a little field trip on my own national park discussion here and profile. This is some pictures I took when I went to the Dr. King National Park in Atlanta. That's the home where he raised his family, and his church is nearby. And if you ever get a chance to visit, I recommend it. But I bring that up because on the one side, I've got this quote: "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." And so that's an idea that I want you to carry through as I talk today, and really thinking about how species and individuals interact with each other, and then how those interactions create the whole. And thinking systemically about things allows us to see how something happening in one area of the community is going to affect the other area of the community. And then I just put this other quote on the other side, that the idea of creating a beloved community, right? And so there are human communities and ecological communities, and this idea of a beloved community was something Dr. King talked a lot about, and I like this too because it talks about qualitative change and quantitative change in our souls, quantitative change in our lives, right? And so as we think about ecology, there are things that we can observe, the qualities of an ecosystem that we can observe. And then the study of ecology has been, an effort to quantify some of those things that people are seeing, and bring out the patterns through, analysis of statistics. So just starting with those ideas today, but let's move on to the ecology, right? So let's start with the field of community ecology is the study of ecological communities, and those are defined as the group of interacting organisms living in a particular area, right? And community ecologists study how the interactions between different populations and individuals affect biodiversity, community structure, and the distribution and abundance of species, right? So these are just some example research questions of the community ecologists, and you can take a look at those, and there's a link to even more of those. But we're going to move on to how communities are defined a little bit more specifically, right? So it's easy to say group of organisms within any area that interact with each other, but nature isn't that clean, and so we've got to kind of refine this definition, right? So physically, discrete habitat boundaries, so that could be all of the organisms living in a particular lake or pond, or living on an island. Taxonomically, you talk about spruce forests or maple beech forest. That's a way that we define a community based on the dominant species. Interactively, existence of strong interactions. So that could be something where we're looking at one that is a ecosystem that's dominated by the relationship between moose and wolves. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. And then there's also statistically, right, the patterns of association among species. And I think that intertidal zones are an area where that's most often done. So I just have these maps and some of these ideas just to kind of refine this idea a little bit, that there's a way to scientifically define things, but it's not that clean. So if we look here, this is a map of all the different ecoregions, or areas, ecological communities, the large scale ecological communities. and they're tightly defined on this map, but that's not always the case. If we look at this map, this is kind of shows a satellite image that shows that things are a little less defined. We can see some kind of lines between things, but we also have to recognize that there are interactions. There aren't walls between these different ecosystems, and those edges create their own communities and make it hard. I'll just move back here. You look at this pond. The trees drop their leaves in the pond and provide nutrients and affect the ecology of the pond, and the same is true for this island. Things come up out of the water onto the island and impact the ecology of the island at the tidal zone. So there aren't these clean boundaries, but you need to create some sort of boundary to study it. So the same is true when we think about individual species. And so let's move on to talk a little bit about the idea of a habitat and a niche, right? Every organism, every species has a habitat and a niche. And those are two different things, because the habitat are the biotic and abiotic factors in an area where an organism lives. And then the niche or niche are all the things that species needs to survive and stay healthy and reproduce, right? So like food, behavior. I think an interesting piece of that is that the behavior of an organism is determined by its environment. And something for you to remember as you've moved back into a new environment, you things are different, and so you're going to behave differently. But the niche is, basically the organism's job, right? So what does it do? What does it eat? How does it affect the ecosystem? And there are these split into these two ideas of fundamental niche. So the space that an organism could occupy. So we actually see over on the right, we see the fundamental niche of this one barnacle species, the thalamus. And then over on the other side, we've got the realized niche. And that's the area that a species actually occupies based on its interactions with other species and the effects of the environment. The activity you do today is going to investigate this much deeper. But I just want to go on another little field trip here. This is a trip I took to Maine. And so it's just going to kind of set up some of the scene of what the intertidal zone looks like. So the intertidal zone has been a subject of study. This is Booth to Bay Harbor, just a little kayaking trip we went on. And there's just another scene for you. But now we'll get a little bit, you'll see here on the rock, we've got different zones of species living there. And this zonation has been a subject of study for ecologists for a long time, to try to figure out, why are there these different zones? Why do some species not live any higher in the intertidal zone than they do? And why other species don't live any lower in the intertidal zone? Here we've got low tide. You'll see that there's all this algae, the Ascophyllum and Fucus, living here. And then up here we can see kind of more of these barnacle layers. And so we've got these different interactions that create these different zones and communities at each zone. And one of the things that is interesting is you do get some pretty well-defined lines in these, that there aren't gradients. There's an above and below. And like I said, the activity is going to lead you through thinking about that a little bit more. The other idea that I want to discuss around niche is that there are equivalent environments, right? So habitats that are similar on different parts of the world, and different species have evolved to fill those different niches. And the species look very similar regardless of where you are on Earth or which one. So over here, I've got the lizards. We're bringing it back to the lizards and the ecomorphs, right? So it's the same idea, is that the different species of lizards evolved to occupy the same niche that occurred on different islands. And so that just speaks to there's some design of morphology and that fits best in those niches. All right, so here we've got a full list of the different species interactions and how they affect each species. So starting with mutualism, it's seen as a win-win, right? There's a positive benefit for species X, positive benefit for species Y. Commensalism, positive benefit for one species and no impact on the other. Predation, pretty clearly benefit for the predator and negative benefit for the prey. Herbivory can be thought of the same way, but there are definitely examples where maybe the plant benefits from the herbivory. Parasitism, commensalism, competition, I'm going to talk a little bit more about. And then that neutralism is an interesting one because, the interactions always have some effect. And so the idea that two species could interact but there'd be no impact usually means they just haven't figured out what that impact is, in my opinion. All right, so here are the three main interactions that I want to just touch on today. Competition, predation, and herbivory, right? So as we think about competition, we've got three main ideas, right? So number one, the fact that organisms compete for shared resources, right? That resources are limited, and competition is going to limit the growth, survival, and reproduction of species, right? So it's usually a lose-lose for the individuals involved, that they don't want to compete if they don't have to. And we'll split competition up into interspecific competition that happens between different species. So a chipmunk and a squirrel might compete for the same seeds. And then there's intraspecific competition that happens within species. So we've got the kangaroos there, but there's a really interesting example out there right now. I'm just going to jump ahead to these gangs of monkeys in Thailand that illustrate, one, that they've been able to coexist peacefully because there's been enough food from the tourists that have been there, but now because of the coronavirus, the tourists have stopped coming. And so now there's limited resources, and the monkeys have started to actually fight with each other. And you can find that online. But it's just an interesting example of how competition happens when resources are limited, and how, again, we're all tied together. That the fact that there are tourists here in the United States, maybe even some of you are planning to go to Thailand for spring break, and the fact that people from the U.S. are not showing up in Thailand means that these monkeys are now in conflict with each other. So I just want to go back a little bit to what things species will compete for. We've got to define that as a resource, right? So things that are required for growth, survival, and reproduction, and that can be consumed and depleted. So food, water, light, space, mates. And then the second idea is here that the limit of abundance and distribution of species, right? So we've got exploitative competition, where they compete for something that can be depleted, so food. So once the food is gone, that's definitely going to limit the abundance and ability for individuals to grow and thrive. And then on the other side, there's interference competition, so things that you can't use up, deplete. So like sunlight, you can't deplete that, but you can definitely keep another individual from getting that. And so as trees, some trees grow fast, so they can occupy all of the light and shade the canopy below, is an example of that. All right. And then the third idea is that species can coexist when they use resources a little bit differently. So there's this idea of competitive exclusion, and if two species are competing directly, they cannot coexist. So if they're trying to get the same space, same food, one will win over the other. The other side of things is resource partitioning, and so if the competitors use resources differently, then they can coexist with each other. And the simple way to describe this is that if they have different niches, they can coexist. And I want to bring it back to the lizards. This is an example of resource partitioning. Each lizard has a different niche, a different place that they live in the ecosystem, different food source. And so they don't, by dividing up the different resources and habitats, they don't compete directly with each other. All right, time for our third field trip of the day, virtual field trip here. Isle Royale National Park is in the Great Lakes. You can watch that later, but it's a place I'd love to go. But is often held up as a living laboratory. You can look into that more, watch that video on your own. But it's looked at as a living laboratory for the study of predator-prey interactions. So in the 1900s, moose swam over to this island. Population exploded. Then in 1940s, wolves walked across an ice bridge. And just to also keep making connections to everything else that you've been learning this semester, this is a small population, so we can also consider the idea of founder effects, genetic bottlenecks, allopatric speciation. Are we getting a new species of wolves that's evolving on this island? And then in 1958, the scientists started studying these populations and their impact on each other, and it's become the longest running ecological study of its kind. You can actually go and participate in this research if you look up IO Royale internships or IO Royale summer courses. You can walk around all summer with a backpack looking at moose bones to see how the moose died. But I just wanted to bring this up because we've got a good opportunity to look at how these systems models can be used to understand how populations impact each other and how feedback loops operate. So on one side we've got the moose, we've got the birth rate, and as moose are born, moose die, and we've got how the rate of births, rate of death, that's going to determine the size of the population, right? And over here we've got the wolves, and so wolf deaths, wolf birth rates all impact the wolf population size, and these two populations impact each other. And so if we press simulate, we're just going to see what's been determined to be a pretty common pattern where the moose population will grow, and as the moose population grows, it allows the predator population to rise, and as that predator population rises, the prey population decreases, and so then eventually the prey population or predator population is going to decline, right? And so we've got some historical data that we can take a look at. All right, it's not going to come up, but this is has been observed over and over again, and you can find lots of different examples of that if you look for them. All right, so that is just a little systems model. But then if we're thinking about systemically, and we're thinking about all of the interactions, this is a fairly simple model, and so it doesn't tell the whole story. So you could take a minute to think about, what sort of interactions are there? If we were going to add more lines to this model, what would we add to show how other species in the ecosystem and the abiotic factors impact the population of moose and wolves? So we could add something like food availability. The moose need to eat, and so their population is impacted by the availability of their food. There's also disease that we could bring into this, that maybe there's something that the wolves get that the moose don't, that would impact the population of wolves. We can think about the impact of weather. Harsh winter might impact the moose and wolf populations. So this is just a good place for us to end this as we think about species interactions and community ecology, and how there are so many different variables that come into play that it can be really challenging to figure out what's actually happening, especially if you're doing work in the field. And then if you try to bring it into a lab, you're not going to get the full picture. So if you tried to take a bunch of moose and wolves and put them in a giant zoo with cages, you would see completely different behavior than you would see in the wild. And so this is what makes community ecology a challenging thing to study, but also a really interesting thing to study. So what you need to do next is spend some time working on this activity. And so what I've got, actually, let me take it to the to-do list here. And I didn't change our Feel Good photo gallery, but there we go. There's the same pictures we had. But so you watch this video. Make sure you study the slideshow. especially play around with that model a little bit of the moose and wolf populations. Make sure you read chapter 45. It goes through the symbiotic relationships in greater depth than I did. I didn't talk about them at all, but it has some information about those. And then you're going to complete this activity, the Barnacle Competition Interactive, right? And make sure that you submit your physiology project by April 5th, right? So make sure you do that. So let me just go on, talk a little bit about this Barnacle Competition Interactive. So there's a worksheet that you'll find on my courses. You don't need to submit this for a grade, but like I have said before, the work you do here will be directly on the exam. So doing this will help you learn what you need to learn and will prepare you for the exam. And if you have any questions, let me know. I'm going to leave it up to you to decide whether you understand this well enough or not. So you're going to go through this activity. It starts with this simulation, so take time to read the background information about tides and niches and the life history of barnacles, and then you're going to run some experiments. So the assignment lays out a few for you to do, but then you're going to need to design 2 of your own experiments that investigate the position and abundance of the 2 different barnacle species in this model and how they're impacted by different variables. You'll pick the variable, you'll adjust it, and you'll see how the 2 populations respond and write about that. If you have any questions, let me know. So, have a great day. Good luck. If you need any help, let me know. It's sunny here in Rochester. If the weather's nice enough for you to get outside where you are, at least go outside, take a few breaths of fresh air, but make sure you're keeping your distance from people and staying healthy and safe. All right, have a good day. Talk to you later.